Hello, everybody.
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today, because today we are talking about the great works of Joe Abercrombie. This is the continuation of our character series for Abercrombie. You may have heard us talk about Logan Nine Fingers. You may have heard us talking about Baez. And today we are talking about another crowd favorite POV character, Sandan Glokta.
You are correct, Charles. And say one thing for the FTF podcast. Oh, wait, not doing Logan. Instead, we're going to start asking the question of why does Glokta do this?
Yes.
And if we're going to really dive into the deep depths of that question with a character who has a whole lot of depth himself, then we want to be able to do that in a way free for us to talk about all three of the books in the First Law Trilogy. So this is a good time if you haven't yet read through Last Argument of Kings, the first three books of the First Law Trilogy, then turn this down in your headphones right now and go check out those awesome books because they're some of our absolute favorites.
Yes, give the First Law Trilogy a read. We're going to be doing a lot more of this kind of content in the future, so if you haven't read it, check it out. Come back, listen to this episode, and be on the lookout for more First Law discussions in the very near future. But today is all about Glokta, Dylan, and I'm excited to get into him. You had said in an earlier episode, I'm going to quote you because I thought what you said was brilliant when you said that and I'm going to paraphrase here, Glokta is the character that perhaps is most aware of the series that he's in. And I think that's a huge part of why he's become one of the most popular fan favorites in the series.
Right. I even grabbed a quote from Glokta Prose here, where he reflects that, and I quote, "I did a good thing, and so, of course, there is a price to be paid." And that feels we've said about Joe Abercrombie's work that no good deed goes unpunished, and that definitely feels like it often rings true in the First Law Trilogy, and Glokta seems to be noticing this pattern. He's a very clever character, and he picks up on when things keep happening in a certain way. And this is something that, like you said, I think makes him a fan favorite in a lot of ways, despite clearly, if you got to know Glokta in real life, I doubt you'd really want to be friends with him. He's a torturer. He has a lot of really messed up things that he does, but in some ways it seems like that might be guided by his awareness of the kind of story that he's in, where good deeds are not rewarded, in fact often punished. So I think that that's a good way to maybe start framing our conversation about, well, why does Glokta do this? In part, maybe it comes from that awareness of the kind of book that he's in. But we'll get into that with more depth as we keep going through this novel.
That's very well said.
This character profile about this trilogy and this character.
Yes, exactly. I understood. And that's a great lens to look at it. The other lens is when Glokta is asking why does he do this, it's this idea of he does these horrible things and he doesn't necessarily he acknowledges he's a horrible person, but he's also got these moments of likability and redemption around him. There's a quote that I pulled that I think is the second lens that we should be looking at Glokta's character, which is, every man has his excuses, and the more vile the man becomes, the more touching the story has to be. What is my story now, I wonder? And that is something from a man who's contemplating how moral he is and if he's good or bad or why he does the things he does. That's a great lens to kind of look at some of these early actions, starting with his actions in the blade itself.
Right. And if we're gonna start banging on that drum of this lens here, Charles, about having reasons, I think that I'll probably add another quote, and then we'll get into
Oh
this
yeah, do it,
discussion.
please. Glokta quotes are the best, so
Right.
always feel free to let one loose.
Yes, and this is the one that I feel if there is a I've said before, I don't think that Joe Abercrombie would say that there's much of a thesis to the arcs in First Law. I think he definitely explores
Beyond like
themes
people
with
are
them.
horrible.
But yeah, I, as a graduate student, start thinking about theses, and I'll say that one that struck me for Glokta and what his arc and a lot of the arcs, honestly, in First Law are about is this quote: each time we have reasons, and it goes on to say, what else can we do but solve one sordid problem at a time? Then one day we look up and find that we are this. And I think that that is a big part of how Glokta ends up who he is just kind of like he's faced with all of these really difficult problems throughout the First Law series with pretty much only wrong answers. And, when you have a bunch of wrong, and when I say wrong, I mean morally wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's almost this counterbalance where the right answer, the logical answer, maybe even the realistic answer, although, once again, not talking about Logan, is the morally wrong answer. And what we get from Glokta, probably more than any character, is a really thoughtful exploration of how to try to balance when all the correct answers logically are morally incorrect. And I think that's in part a big reason why people love Glokta is like, while Logan, we've talked about how he's a more like personable seeming person, but also he's just constantly rationalizing and justifying all these like morally wrong decisions. Glokta seems to be trying. He's just got this logic to him and this understanding of the story he's in that makes it difficult for him to really make the like morally just choice. But he does try. He does try, Joe.
He does try, and I think we're gonna come back to that quote of like, and he tries and he pays for it more
Right.
often than not. But the first kind of action that we see him, the first situation that he's in is when he's interrogating Salem Ruse. And I always thought this introduction to Glokta was so interesting because we meet him and already he's kind of detached and looking at it with kind of a humorous angle and kind of a, funny angle. He's lamenting about stairs and how they're his biggest enemy. And then he's like, interesting how people change once you start torturing them. Like he's having all these musings to himself while he's torturing someone that he knew in his previous life as a soldier, Salem Ruse, his friend. And the fact that this is a guy who is kind of funny and interesting, but at the same time actively torturing someone he once considered a friend. It's very much a great way to kick off the character of Glokta. It's very Glokta-esque.
Yeah, and we do learn through this, this start for Glokta's arc is torturing a person who will eventually come back around and meet Glokta again. Right. And I guess we'll get to what that means about why Glokta does this.
I mean, we can spoil it. I mean, it's interesting to see Salem Ruse return at the end.
Right.
Glokta's arc coming full circle almost, where he was torturing Ruse, and then now by the end, he's teaching Ruse how to torture others. It's very interesting to see that go around.
Yes. So right here in the blade itself, we are kind of maybe we're asking these questions already from Glokta of why do I do this, and maybe ourselves. It's hard for us to really put ourselves in the place of a torturer and understand why they do this. And the way that Abercrombie so masterfully characterizes Glokta as someone that we somehow can start to understand is that he doesn't know himself. He doesn't know
Right.
why he does it. So we're like, why would you do this? And he's like, why
I
do
don't.
I do
Yeah,
this?
he's like, I don't know, because it's what I'm good at, and
Hmm.
um, that question comes up over and over again, where it's like, you were tortured so horribly, how could you turn around and become a torturer? That's the other thing of like violence begets more violence, and he's like, well, I'm not prepared for like anything else. This is it for me, and that is another huge theme throughout the series, and part of Glokta's kind of identity struggle, I guess.
Yeah, that's well said, Charles. Definitely something that he's grappling with throughout this series is that identity struggle.
Right. So we get a few more moments in the Blade itself. It's kind of quiet with Glokta. He's investigating the Guild of Mercers, and that's when he learns about the bank for the first time, but he doesn't really think about it that much. Um, we have the break-in and explosion in the Magus's chamber when Baez returns, and he's staying in the tower, and it explodes, and Glokta's investigating, and that's when we get this meeting with Glokta and Baez, and Glokta is doing this interrogation, and it's very funny to see. Like, we're so used to Logan and Baez and their point of view, and Glokta and his point of view, and this is the first time we're getting their perspectives of each other, right? Seeing Logan removed, like in the third person, watching him react to stuff was very funny. Glokta thinks like, oh, these guys are obviously con artists.
Hmm.
They're obviously up to something, and I'm gonna figure it out. It's very entertaining, but doesn't speak too much to Glocker's character, I don't think. Just that he's
I think,
skeptical at all times.
well, yeah. And here's another piece that I thought always brought depth to Glokta's questioning
Mm-hmm.
in the blade itself is we get that moment with Glokta and West, and I think I did chat about this some in our blade itself episode,
Mm-hmm.
but Glokta, it's like after he was hauled up after getting so brutally injured and he can't leave his like he's staying with his mother at that point. This is all backstory stuff.
Right.
He was hoping that someone would come visit him and thought probably the most likely person would be Column West. And I think that it's really interesting that in the like present storyline in the Blade itself, the one thing that Glokta does not seem to question is why West never showed up to visit him.
Right.
And West actually did show up to visit Glokta and was turned away by Glokta's mother, who did not like that West was a commoner and was affiliating with Glokta.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because like that played out in a very logical way that you'd expect Glokta to be able to kind of figure out. Is like, well, I know my mother, I know West's background, I'm a pretty logical and clever dude, but he doesn't even think at any
Yeah.
point to question that like understanding that, oh well, of course no one would want to come visit me because I'm so pitiful and people only liked me when I was this like great renowned amazing swordsman who won the contest. And I think Glokta questions almost everything except that he at his base is like a bad person,
Yeah.
and it's and like a bad and undesirable person. And I think that that brings this extra layer of sympathy that we can feel for Glokta and humanity that we can notice in him.
Yeah, that's very well said. You basically just described his arc for the Blade itself, right? It starts with him making all these deductions and investigating the Guild of Mercers and going toe to toe with Baez in an investigation setting. And he's always skeptical, never fully believing what he sees, questioning everything. It's his job to be an inquisitor, right? And like, what's the one thing that he always took for granted and never bothered to investigate was why no one visited him, why no one was friends with him, and he never stopped to solve, like you said, this very obvious puzzle of my mom probably turned him away. I should maybe go
Right.
talk to him, right? You know, like touch base every once in a while. But Glokta is so like self-deprecating in a lot of
Yes.
ways, and he's also still the victim of like this traumatic torturing, and then he like kind of killed his past life basically, and has embraced this new identity of someone who is a torturer, and I torture people and I don't
Mm.
have friends. You know, he's so bought into that.
Charles, you had me thinking that we've talked a lot about this idea that Glock is the most aware of the novel that he's in.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm starting to realize that Glokta might be the only character in this series, or at least like point of view character, that has frequent moments of being pleasantly surprised by the way that events play out in reality for him. And
Yeah.
this is one of those first times where it's like Glokta is so cynical and so aware he's in this like grim dark feeling setting that the fact that West actually did come to visit him is like, oh, what a pleasant surprise that that was actually the case. I underestimated like I thought things
Right.
were worse than they actually are. And we get lots of these other moments. Like I'm thinking about when Pharaoh almost kills him and then decides not to kill
Or
him
how about when he marries
and
Artie? You know, she
marries
says yes.
Artie. It's like he's so aware that like this is the most like horrible thing and she'd never want to be with me, and if she does say yes to this it's just because it's the only way that she could survive, and she says yes and like is actually way more invested in the marriage and him as a person than he ever dared to imagine. And you
Right.
kind of I'm interested as we keep moving through this to see uh like how frequently Glokta ends up actually like pleasantly surprised that somehow in Joe Abercrombie's grimdark world, he gets these moments that he's so cynical, Glokta, that even Joe Abercrombie's work is better, like more pleasant than he would expect.
Yeah, I mean, when you accept everything about being in an Abercrombie world, all the good things would seem kind of surprising.
Right.
And Glokta's kind of embraced all these unpleasant things about himself and his actions and the world. That you're right. Anything that is good is kind of interesting and exciting and surprising for Glokta. There's
Yeah.
some other
And for
stuff.
us
Oh,
as
go ahead.
readers.
Yeah, and for us
So
as
again, it's a
readers,
way in which he mirrors us as readers and probably contributes to why he's such a favorite character.
well said. And go back to Blade itself. There's a few other things. We've got the contest, and even though Glokta doesn't believe in magic, he's like, I know it's not possible for Bias to have cheated in the contest, but I'm still suspecting that he is. So that was kind of a fun thing. Like he's questioning that. He's questioning that magic might be real because I think he's cheating, versus questioning anything about himself, about why he's not friends with Wes. And then he sees the House of the Maker, and he's kind of shocked to realize that magic might be real and Baez might be the real deal. And then we've talked about the Glokta and Wes being best friends again kind of realization, which was a really fun, interesting twist. Like Abercrombie weaves in such surprising twists and payoffs that you're not really expecting or necessarily asking for, but constantly delivers. And this is one of them. And I think the like Salem Ruse reveal at the end is another
Oh
one
yeah.
where you're like, hey, I wasn't expecting this, but this is nice. I'm down. And that's kind of how I felt about the Glokta West thing, where it's like, you know what, there may be some redeeming aspects of Glokta after all. And that is what gets tested in our next book here before they are hanged.
Great seg.
Thank you. Would you like to kick us off, buddy?
Sure. Well, Before They're Hanged is I would say the most Glokta central book
Mm-hmm.
that that we get in the First Law Trilogy, and it pretty much begins with Glokta arriving at Dagaska, and he's been put in this situation where he is the voice of the crown in this city that is going to be under siege. And it gives Glokta the opportunity to, rather than being kind of like this puppet on a string that he often is when he's closer to Archlector Salt, who is in charge of the Inquisition. It gives Glokta some free reign to not be micromanaged, and we get to really see his ability to engage in this politicking and his gift for handling all of that. We also get to really focus on his relationships with a bunch of other characters, and he makes a lot of efforts here, I think, to be a better person throughout before they're hanged. I think he really shines in this novel.
I agree. He gets a real moment to kind of flex his like deduction skills and his plotting and his scheming and his knowledge of navigating politics and it's just a fun story. There's this mystery element to it of like what happened to the last Inquisitor here or something. What I forget the title of it, but what happened to the last
Superior?
Superior? Thank you. And they don't know. So they're investigating, and there's this impending doom of a Gurkish invasion, and Glokta's kind of getting everyone prepared. And here's what's interesting about Glokta, because yes, he indiscriminately will torture anybody, including former friends, but he's also willing to work with and help people. Like the Union is so bogged down in like bigotry and classism and things like that. And Glokta, raised in all of this, even in a noble house, is like sees through all of it, and he's willing to be like, we need to pay the common people and the native people and get them working, and I'm willing to give you, the representative of the native people, like more power and access if you support me, whereas other superiors or other people in the Union wouldn't even look twice at native people. So it's really interesting to see Glokta kind of make these concessions and see everyone as equal, but he also thinks very low of all people at the same time. So it's a really interesting combination for Glokta in these moments.
For sure. And one of the first things that Glokta does when he gets there is see the ways in which Harker, who was an inquisitor, I believe, who was kind of in charge of things in the absence of this missing superior, had been engaging in just this brutal impractical and I at first didn't mean that as a pun because practicals, but a very impractical way of trying to gain information from people that is unnecessarily violent and almost reveling in the violence of torturing people, especially these poor, like, beleaguered in a lot of ways like native Dagaskins. And one of the folks that seems to be a native Dagaskin that is being tortured is Shickle. We later learn Shickle's an eater, and all these kind of things play out with that. But Glokta is someone who never revels in torture for torture's sake.
Mm-hmm.
He never enjoys causing people pain unnecessarily, and he is absolutely infuriated by what he sees that Harker has done in Dagaska, and he basically subjects Harker to pretty bad I can't remember if he kills Harker or not, but at least like
I don't think he kills him, but he might at least lock him up or imprison him. I don't remember, but he definitely is fired and removed from office and all these other things.
Perhaps tortured. And he releases Shickle is another big thing.
And when he's doing it sometimes, like maybe not in the case with Shickle, but with other characters that he's helping out, he often even acknowledges that it might not be the most practical idea, where it's like, oh, well, this might be an issue, but Like, why? Like, he's asking himself, why do I do this? Like, usually it's why does he just torture people? But now it's why is he saving people? You know, he's
Right.
asking the same question, different context. And in this case, it's like, why am I saving these people? Sometimes he goes as far as to be like, Sandan Glokta, shield to the helpless, which he's being very sarcastic. And he's like, is it ever too late to be ... a good man? You know, like he dares thinks that of himself. And saving Shickle's the beginning of one of the themes in Glokta's arc in this book of like this good deed going unpunished idea, you know, where it's like the irony here is that this guy that he deposed actually had the right idea of keeping Shickle locked up because she was the eater, you know, so it's very funny to see that play out.
Yeah.
Funny in like an ironic, twisted way.
As Abercrombie's work often is. So
Yes.
we get the flip side of the coin of why do I do this, which is why does Glokta choose to release Shickle, who seems to be this like poor tortured girl, when he knows that like pretty much in his experience no good deed has ever really gone unpunished, and he does it anyway. So why on that side of the coin? Because I do think deep down beneath it all, Glokta does want to be a good person. So why does he do the good things? Because he's trying, because he wants to be a good person, even though many, many times he falls well short of that. And why does he do these bad things? We'll continue to explore it, but I think oftentimes it's because he feels like he has to. He has no other options if he wants to make his way in this messed up world around him.
Yes, that is incredibly well said. And that's also, you know, we know that he is wheeling and dealing in Dagaska, and he makes deals with Valen and Bach to take a loan for the defenses. He also recruits Nikamo Casca, famed soldier of fortune. And, you know, those are all great scenes as well. He's like, he understands the risks that he's taking, but he's never really concerned about his own self-preservation. He's always like, oh, body found floating by the docks, like here I go putting myself in harm's way again. Here I go taking this incredible risk, making a deal with this shady bank. It might haunt me later, but you know, I got to do what's practical for right now. And
Nailed it.
thank you, that's just part of Glokta's character. It's actually served him quite well. This idea of like not always kind of embracing his demise, and he always kind of realizing like, oh, this might be the deal that seals my fate, kind of, you know.
For sure. Yeah, and a big thing with Glokta, he is so willing to accept death if it should come to him, and almost views it with this what do we like to say, like with it's this detached curiosity
Yeah.
that he views most things with.
Right.
And the one thing, another why does he do this, was his motivation if he doesn't even care about surviving. I'm
Yes.
paraphrasing here, but there's a moment where he's basically like, I don't care about dying, but I refuse to lose.
Yes, and he's always super curious as
Yes.
well. He always wants to know why.
He wants
so
to know.
You think someone who like doesn't care if they live or die, like why would they be so invested in politics and things like that? It's because he can't help himself. He has an inquisitive mind, and he needs to know. And he also just likes the game. Like you said, he doesn't like losing, and that services him quite a bit. But he surprises himself sometimes, as we know when he saves Vitari, right, the head of the Spice Guild or something like that in Dagaska.
No. Well, he does save Vitari as well, but
Vitari's
the
impractical. I got them confused. So he saves her eventually. But
Eider is who you're thinking of.
Yeah,
Carlotta
Eider.
and Eider.
Thank you very much.
Guild of Spicers.
So he saves Eider first, and then also saves Vitari. So he's in these moments, like the city of Dagaska is being sieged, and he uncovers all these political schemes. And when he talks to Eider is the most interesting one, because he's, you know, asking why. That's a question he always likes to get the answer to. And she has pretty noble motives. She's like, look, if you think about it from a detached point of view, like this land holds no value to anyone but the Gurkish. I was going to make a deal to have a peaceful transition where no one has to die and it's the same result. And Glokta's like, oh, that's a noble motive. That's a good idea. But,
Right.
I'm a practical and this is what I do. And going to,
Well, superior.
I'm a superior and this is what I do. I'm just going to keep doing it.
Yeah.
Which is another
Right.
interesting piece of Glokta's character. Like sometimes he'll follow orders and do these horrible things even when they're not necessarily the most correct or noble because he's playing the politics game as well.
Correct, I believe, Charles, and my my good man. And I
Thank you,
think
sir.
that the I think that the thing here, it's another moment for Glokta that reinforces this no good deed goes unpunished bit for him, is like he's searching constantly for like, who is this traitor, this dark person who's trying to uh, have the city turned over to the Gurkish, no doubt for these awful motives of getting rich or what have you. And he finally gets to the solution, and he is probably unsurprised, really, in the end, to find out that the person who is the traitor is the person with probably the most noble motives of
Yeah.
anyone he's interacted with along the way. In
Yes.
Carlot Den Eider, it's like she confesses everything, and it's like, wait, you were like legitimately trying to do what was best for everyone. And
Right.
of course, Glokta's like, well, no wonder you're here getting like potentially tortured by me, because that doesn't work out for anyone well. But because he's someone that cares so much about like trying to do right, even if he wouldn't in Eider's shoes have gone to this length, he
Right.
does want to eke out that little victory for good. And I'll return to this later when we get to toward the end of Last Argument of Kings. Is Glokta is why does he do this? Why does he do things like letting Eider go? Because for Glokta, the good comes in these little victories that you can eke out in this really grimdark world
Oh, that's
around
well said. Yeah, it certainly is, and it's interesting how they all pay off. Glokta's kind of learning lessons in this book that he later employs in Last Argument of Kings. So it's interesting to kind of track all of these teachable moments for Glokta. Like he released Schickel, which ended up not working out for him. He
him. Right. Almost kills him.
almost kills him. He releases Carla Den Eider, which almost kills him again, and then he saves Vitari as well, which kind of not nearly as consequential as the other two, but also interesting. And then he also saves Artie. So in this book, he's doing a lot of like decent deeds throughout, but ultimately leaving Dagaska to its fate, and ultimately um, facing negative, like almost getting killed in the case of Schickel, and then long term, Ida returns and tries to blackmail him and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
and so he's like, "Oh, of course," but he does do a decent amount of good deeds in this book.
Right. And it's very Glokta where like you can save Carlot Den Eider, the one person who had these super noble motives, and you might just get away with that, but you're not going to save the city. This is a Joe Abercrombie novel, and things
Right.
are going to end in a way that big picture was not. Not a lot of good was done in Dagaska, but Glokta eked out actually what he could. And I think Before They're Hanged is a book that sticks out to me as like Glokta's really his biggest efforts toward being a good person
Yes.
take place in Before They're Hanged, and in
Yes.
classic Abercrombie fashion, things start to move more toward this like full circle, like you have to acknowledge that you can't be constantly doing like trying to do good or it's going to come back to bite you as we move toward Last Argument of Kings.
That is very well said, Dylan. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's move on to Last Argument of Kings. At the end of Before They're Hanged, Crown Prince Reynald is found brutally murdered in the palace. That's something that is kind of worth talking about, where, Glokta has dealt with Gurkish ambassadors before, and the one that like is in the when Prince Reynald is murdered, um, you know, uh, what's his face, Salt, orders Glokta to torture the Gurkish ambassador. And Glokta knows that this guy is a chill dude and really nice, and they could actually work towards some sort of armistice. Like he had the way out of like, we'll give you this chest and you can say whatever you want was in it, and end the war,
Mhm.
which is basically what Eider was working towards in Dagasta. And Glokta's like, oh, sorry. Why do I do this? Well, I don't know. And he tortures the Gurkish ambassador and just causes the war of Last Argument of Kings to play out. I just thought that was an interesting one to
Well,
bring up before we moved on, just
right,
because it's
and
another one of Glokta's interesting decisions.
yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about why does he do it when it comes to torturing that ambassador,
Yes.
because you know who's looking through a peephole and watching the torture take place during that is Archlector Salt.
Yes.
So why does Glokta do that? What other choice does he have? He
Right.
could try to stand up for morality and walk out the room and say, I'm not doing this. And Archlector Salt will just send in someone else to do it.
Yes.
And I think that that's when Glokta is going to do these really horrific, gruesome things, is when he looks around and feels this helplessness of, if it's not me, then it'll just be someone else, and or if I don't do this, then things could even get worse, or what
Right.
have you. So
He has this like
he's
inevitability. He like
right,
understands the inevitable and it is willing to embrace it, even if it's doing something horrible, like torturing an innocent person and
right,
kicking off a huge siege of a war where tons of people are going to die. It's like it's inevitable, and
exactly.
I'm okay with being a part of it because I understand that it's what needs to happen. It's just the reality of politics and of intrigue and everything else.
Yeah, and there are more noble characters that would have stood up for morality there, and I
It wouldn't
mean,
have gotten him
they
far, probably.
no, I mean, best case scenario, they walk out that room and Archlector Salt doesn't severely punish them, and they just move on with their lives, and nothing big picture
No,
changes
everyone wants this
about
war to happen.
right.
Like
So
Baez, Salts, they're all like, let's go.
yeah, and of course, like we don't want to condone what Glokta does here. What he does is
No,
terrible, and the right thing to do would be to try to walk out that room and not do it and try to stop it. But Glokta, end of the day, oftentimes does not make the morally correct decision. He makes the more, as we've said, practical
right.
decision.
And speaking of morally compromised decisions here, we've got the opening to Last Argument of Kings, where Glokta is bribing and threatening his way to votes for Archlector's candidate for king, which gets turned towards this almost like this democracy voting idea of like all of the noble houses vote for who is going to be the next king, and it becomes basically this like race to see who can like bribe the most votes, right? So that's
Right?
kind of how this kicks off, and it's kind of a fun like reminder that this is the world you're living in, right? It's morally compromised. It's squabbling amongst everyone. This is the world in which Glokta is kind of trying to survive in.
Yes, and in this moment of democracy, well, not really, but this moment of voting anyway, uh, things have been turned over to the wisdom of crowds,
Yes,
and we know,
nice.
and Joe Abercrombie, I would say, doesn't have a lot of faith, at least in the way he portrays it in Last Argument of Kings, that the wisdom of crowds would go so smoothly here. It's a lot of bribing. It's a lot of really nefarious deeds taking place, blackmailing and things like that. And Glokta, a lot of times he ends up in these situations where forces so much bigger than him are making him do these things, and that's a big part of what's happening in Last Argument.
For sure. We're also reminded of this whole Glokta, Jazal, Artie triangle situation relationship that's happening here, where Glokta is coming to Artie's defense, concerned for her well-being. So we get the juxtaposition of Glokta bribing votes, and then he goes off and he's trying to protect the virtue of Artie at the same time, right? So it's interesting to see those things happening side by side. This is so Glokta to a T of like, yeah, overall, I'm like in the middle of some really deep political intrigue that's going to cause a lot of people to get killed. But, and it's always often morally compromised, but don't mess with my friend, Jazal. Like, back off at the same time. So, very interesting to
Yep,
see that play out.
exactly. Trying to eke out a little bit of good by seeing if he can hold to his word and protect Artie in some way, because he did promise West that he'd try. And he does definitely take a liking to Artie. You can see that those interactions play out in a way where, I, I mean, they're a great fit, I guess. Like, just
Yes.
a great pairing, those two. Two misfits in this society that kind of are, I wouldn't say forced together, but like in this situation where it's kind of like just the two of them, and it makes sense for them to interact a lot, and they're both willing to look past some of these more surface level things about the other person that's making them a misfit and get to the root of who the other person is.
Right.
And
They're also
I
both
think
really smart and
right.
can have like they have really good banter, and they're both
Yep.
kind of self-deprecating, and this they have like they both have this very unique sense of humor about themselves. So they are great. They're a very interesting fit, and even this deep in, right, where it's like in the reread you can see it happening, but very much like Glokta and Wes, like at least for my first read through anyway, I never even imagined the possibility that Glokta would get married and get married to Artie. You know,
Right.
it's something that when it happens, you're like, of course. But the whole time it's being developed, it's not even on your radar, and that's just because we're bought into this kind of person that Glokta is, like incapable of something as pleasant as a marriage and a
Right. And
family.
I know for me too, I was so bought into the Giselle and Artie relationship and what was going on there on my first read, and so used to how fantasy stories would typically pair those two off. Just, but they, Giselle and Artie, have this kind of will they won't they thing going on throughout, and we're waiting for Giselle to have this like character development moment where he finally figures out that like Artie is quote unquote the one, and they're gonna end up together, and he kind of has that, but unfortunately it was like at the beginning of the last book, or
Right.
rather than at the end of the last book. And in classic Abercrombie fashion, he reverts Giselle back to like not being able to act on any of those realizations he may or may not have truly had.
Yeah.
And I was so like stuck in that kind of mindset with it of like, oh, how are Giselle and Artie going to end up together, that I never considered really Glokta and Artie as a possible pairing on the first read. But then when you reread this, like you were saying, Charles, it seems so clear that it's like, well, this is what Abercrombie was building all along. These two makes total sense.
Right.
Artie and Glokta do.
Yeah, no, it's really well constructed, and the scene at the end where he's proposing to her is so good as well. Like he describes it as like he's about to do this horrible thing to her. Like you think he's gonna murder her with a dagger, right? Where he's like, "I grip the cold steel. She has no idea what's about to happen," and then
Right.
he's like, "Will you marry me?" And she's like, "Yes, I will," and he's shocked, and that's such a fun moment that we'll talk a little bit more. I want to talk about that more because what's interesting is in the beginning we get this juxtaposition of bribing votes and like Glokta confronting Jazal for the sake of Artie, and then at the end you get that marriage proposal juxtaposed with Glokta threatening the Countess Therese, which is another super horrible thing, perhaps one of the most horrible things Glokta does.
Yes.
Um, just on a psychological level is absolutely horrible. So like these two things being juxtaposed is just Glokta's character. This is the world that he lives in. These horrible atrocities juxtaposed with his small victories, his personal victories, and he's trying to, make his small, happy connections, but he's involved in these horrible forces. And the juxtaposition of the two throughout this book was super interesting, and I'm glad that we get to, in this Why Does Glokta Do This, kind of talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, the way that he coerces uh, Queen Therese in this series, I think it's, for me, it's the hardest thing to read of anything that Glokta does the whole time. And Glokta does some really messed up things. I mean, torture scenes that are written in full detail. But this one's always the hardest for me to get through, and I think it is this reminder at the end of Last Argument Kings for all the good things that Glokta has really tried to do throughout this series. Like,
Yep.
this is the world he lives in, and he is not someone who has the moral fortitude to stick up for doing the right thing in these more big picture situations. He's much more about the, like, well, maybe I can eke out a little bit of like good here, but he's who he is. He's a torturer. He's a bad dude in a lot of ways, and this is one of his worst atrocities.
Right. And it's something where, like, the solution could be so simple of, like, oh, if only Giselle and Artie had stayed together, or if only, like, like, things could be, like, they shouldn't be married. But no, they forced the situation to be to fit the political narrative. And it leads to these, like, almost seemingly senseless kind of acts of cruelty on Galactus' part. But he takes them in stride, and it's just part of the job that he has to do. And it's, despicable, but it's a central part to Galactus' character. And I think Abercrombie's making sure we don't forget that
Yes.
at the end here, because there's so many good things that have happened. Like, Glokta had this exciting action piece, and he got redemption, and he's doing all these other things. He's engaged to he protects Artie, and there's like, oh, don't forget, he's still in this role, and he's basically um he's the puppet ruler for Baez, and we know all about Baez. So, like, don't forget these things that he's capable of doing in these moments. So, absolutely,
Exactly.
that's a great moment. Right before this, one moment that I really want to make sure that we talk about is, like, while the Gurkish siege is going on, um, Glockus between a rock and a high place. The high place being Salt's office, and the rock being Valiant and Balk, right? So he's trying to find his third suitor, which is what Artie advised him to do, and that's third suitor's basically like, get your house in order, and then maybe I can do something. And in his attempts to get his house in order, he discovers two things: that Severod is betrayed him, and then also Frost has betrayed him.
Right.
And, like, Severod we may not be too surprised about, but Glokta was, I think, most hurt by Frost, and he asks Frost why. And, like, he's asking, why did you do this, which is interesting. And Frost has the same reaction Glokta often does, which is the shrug. Like, I'm doing these things the same reason you are, the shrug. I don't know.
Yeah. I I imagine that Frost was just feeling in the same kind of place as Glokta, like you're saying, Charles. Like, this is what made sense when people much more powerful than me were pulling my strings, and it's it's not personal, just like it's never personal for Glokta, really. It's just what you have to do at times if you're going to stay alive, and
Interesting to see Glokta on the victim side of it. He's so constantly musing, "Why do I do this?" to others, but now he's asking, "Why did you do this to me?" And that's with
right.
Frost, who we've grown up with, all these books, all this time with Frost. He's a cornerstone of Glokta's. Like, he doesn't have, like, a lot of family or friends or all that, but he always kind of trusted in Frost, and so that was, I think, a really big betrayal for him.
Yeah, and I think to to stick further to like what happens to Glokta and then how he chooses to enact that onto other people, I think a key scene for Glokta and the way that he relates to his practicals happens in a way, and this is in Last Argument, in a chapter called Prepared for the Worst,
Hmm.
where Glokta is basically treated absolutely horribly by Salt, where like Salt tells him to get something done, and he just launches a bunch of vitriolic like slurs at Glokta and treats him like absolute crap while telling him to go take care of tasks for him.
Right.
And then Glokta goes on to do the same thing to Severard, I believe it is. And he treats Severard in kind of this like very similar manner to how Salt treats Glokta when he's
Okay.
telling him to do things. He's like, if I this paraphrase is like, oh, like Severard's like, how should I do that? And he's like, if I wanted to be telling you how to like do everything, then I'd go do it myself. Like figure it out. And that's kind of the same thing that Salt was saying to him, to Glokta, that is. And it's this moment that gives us another little hint into the fact that like Glokta sees how he's treated by others who have power over him, and he ends up doing that to other people, and that's such a big thing where you can look at someone like Salt, who's obviously like navigated, at least to this point, the
Mm-hmm.
world in a very successful way in terms of surviving and gaining power and those kind of things. And Glokta's like, I guess this is how it's done, and he treats others, but he's a little bit less cruel than how Salt does it. And I think that's also a key part of Glokta's character is like he's not quite throwing the same slurs or anything. He's not quite treating Severard in the same level of like with the same level of meanness, for lack of a better way to
Right.
phrase it.
Right.
And I think that's Glokta to a T.
No, that's
Is
really well
like
said. I do think this like circle of authority and violence is a huge part of Glokta's character arc across all the trilogy. And
right.
I think that's proven with the whole trilogy ends with this like circle completion of Glokta's arc. There's a quote that I didn't pull, but to paraphrase it, he's like, "Oh, first you're told to torture, then you teach how to torture, then you instruct the torturing," right? That's kind of like the process that
Yeah.
Glokta had mentioned a few times.
Can
And
I
oh, you have
I
it?
have a quote, which is an internal monologue moment from Glokta in one of the last chapters, which is first it is done to us,
Mm,
then we do it to others, then we order it done. Such is the
yes.
way of things.
Thank you. That's exactly the quote. That's and that Glokta we know was tortured by the Gurkish and became an inquisitor, but now Baez has given him basically control, like ultimate authority in the city. And we discover at the end that Pike is Salem Ruse, which goes way
Right.
back to the beginning of the story where Glokta was the one instructed to torture Ruse as part of his investigation of the Guild of Mercers. So we're at that second stage of like it's done to you, then you do it to others, right? And now we're at this moment where Glokta's like, "Hey, Pike, or Ruse, I see myself in you. I can give you this far more suitable revenge, right?" And that's when he is showing practical Pike
Yes.
how to um, torture. In this case, it was Salt who was in his prison cell.
So yeah, and can I drop something by there,
Please
Charles, that
do.
I've been thinking about is, Logan has to be realistic about these things,
Mm-hmm.
and we end up in this moment where Pike at the end through Glokta realizes he has to be practical about these
Yes,
things, right? Like I
I.
do wonder that like the choice of the word practical for that position, practical as a synonym basically for like pragmatic or realistic or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I do wonder if that was deliberate by Abercrombie to try to drive home this like Pike makes the practical choice in the end to join up with Glokta in the same way that Glokta has been making these practical choices all along.
I mean that it seems to be there. I know Abercrombie. That seems to be his whole thesis in the world of First Law of how he views humanity in the First Law. It's like being practical means, you know, embracing the harsh realities of life and being realistic about your relationship with other people and in politics and things like that. And it's always this grim, dark perspective. And, you know, Pike is, it's kind of, you see Glokta coming again. Like, this is Glokta in the early stages, kind of, right? This is practical. Pike is not too different from, you know, Blade itself, Glokta. And I think that's the whole point of this, is that like the cycle continues. And it's interesting to see Glokta embrace that, and then to see Pike, who had the opportunity to kill Glokta and get his revenge, instead embrace this, why do I do this part of myself, like tortured becoming torturer theme.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how the series ends, right? So it's like, okay, well, there's more to expect from this idea of, you know, violence inciting more violence, and trying to ask the question, why did Pike, instead of killing Glokta, agree to work for him and torture Salt? You know, it's the question that is kind of the theme of Glokta's whole decision-making process throughout the whole trilogy.
Right. And I think this cyclical nature of how these things play out is super important to this question of why does Glokta do this, and to Glokta's arc. And I'll also say, Charles, as I've been thinking about this, why
Mm-hmm.
does Glokta do this question, I've more and more been wanting to try to synthesize this why does Glokta do the bad things and why does Glokta do the good things question. I think they're actually, they can be kind of brought together.
Okay.
And I'm thinking he does the bad things because he has to, right? But he really wants to do the good things. And one of the last chapters that we get here, actually right before the one that we've been talking about with Pike,
Mm-hmm.
is called "Not What You Wanted," and we get this moment where Jazal, who's now been made king but doesn't really rule the Union because Baez is behind everything, is asking Glokta, who has a little bit more of the manager role
Right.
in Baez's kingdom than does Jazal. Jazal's asking Glokta, like, maybe we could find a way to create a hospital for people who can't afford surgeons, and we can help people. And he's coming up with all these ideas, and Glokta is sort of saying, well, that would be nice, but like that's not really where Baez wants us to go here, and we don't want to upset. He says, but our mutual friend, we would not wish to disappoint him.
Right.
And I think Jazal knows he doesn't want to disappoint Baez either.
Right.
But we get this moment, Charles. I'm going to grab a quote from Glokta, which is, perhaps in time, funds could be found for some small project. Our friends cannot see everything after all, and what he does not see will do no harm. I am sure between the two of us, quietly, we could do some little good, but not yet. And
That's
I
a
think
brilliant
that,
quote you pulled. Brilliant.
thank
That's what
you,
we've been talking
love
about
it.
all day.
Right, and that's just why I said like we'll get back to this when we're talking. I think about Eider, and I'm like, here's the thing when it comes to Glokta. Why does he do this? Why does he do all of these terrible things? Because if Glokta were to die, if he were to lose, if he were to go away, then there would be no one to try to eke out those little goods that he does try to find a way to make happen. And if someone like Archlector Salt is in charge, you're not going to get even those tiny moments of hope or glimmers of pro-social action that you get from Glokta. So that's why he does it, I think, Charles, because without him trying to do a little bit of good, there may be no good at all. That's why he does all the bad.
Very well said. I'm clapping. That was awesome. And I think you nailed it, because it's totally true. Glokta loves to play the game. He loves to win, but he understands that there's a game that he plays, but he also tries to work in the good when he can. And if it's not him, it would be somebody that might not be trying to do any of those good moments.
Mm-hmm.
So we're hopeful for Glokta, even though he's done horrible, like, in sometimes irredeemable things. It's like, well, he's trying to do good as well, and we can only hope for the best for good old Glokta.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely hope for the best, and we'll see if we get any more. I know the answer to this, but I'm trying to be spoiler free for everything beyond Last Argument of Kings. So we'll see if we do get any more of Glokta as we keep moving through the First Law world, and we can see if there's any opportunities to keep this conversation rolling about why Glokta does the things that he does. But
I'm hopeful,
I've really enjoyed
or at least to see
the
character. Consequences of his actions. I've only read these 3 in one of the standalones, so I don't know. But there are opportunities in the standalones and in the Age of Madness that we might be able to see some of the ripple effects of some of Glokta's actions, and who knows.
Yeah, well, I know, but
Dylan
but I won't say. How about that? So, I mean, this is, I guess we kind of do this at the end. We did this with Logan too, to some extent. You know, we've been kind of hard on Glokta in some ways, but maybe like more measured than we were on Logan. Logan, we were pretty all in on this.
I think we had to push really hard because everyone likes Logan and thinks he's good. So I think we did feel like we had to compensate for that a little bit by being hard on him. But I think everyone knows outwardly that Glokta's a torturer and like he does bad stuff. So I don't think we had to push as hard.
Yeah, and our message that we like to make sure we leave everyone with here after we call a character a bad person a lot during the series or during the episode is a reminder that we both think that Glokta is an extremely compelling character, one that we would never have spent the last hour talking in depth about if we didn't think that he was brilliantly portrayed by Joe Abercrombie, even if he's oftentimes doing a lot of bad deeds, and I think you would definitely make the case as an overall bad person. He is an extremely good character and compelling character to read about and talk about, Charles, especially when I get the opportunity to talk about him with you, my lifelong friend.
The pleasure is all mine, Dylan. Why do I do this? Because I enjoy talking fantasy with my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan. That's why I do this. It's a very short book, not very compelling, but it's true.
You're saying your book of why you do the...
Yeah, I don't get a trilogy of exciting political intrigue and moral dilemmas and things. It's just very simple. 2 sentences.
Right. Not nearly as compelling as the overall First Law Trilogy. It's Charles's story of why he does the Friends Talk, his memoir. Why do I do this? Misadventures in podcasting on fantasy with Charles.
Yes. That is exactly right. And it all comes back to my good buddy Dylan and the great works of authors like Joe Abercrombie. So without any further delay, I think we should get into that sweet, sweet outro music.
I think it's time.
It's time. Thank you, everyone, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. If you want to stay up to date on the further character series we're going to be tossing out about the First Law, if you want to join any discussions, support the show, best place to do that is over on Twitter at the FTF podcast with a number 1 at the end. Another great option is Facebook or Instagram at the FTF podcast. You can always send us an email at the FTF podcast at gmail.com. And Dylan, if they wanted to support the show even more in a way that was free and super helpful, and they just so happen to be listening on Apple Podcasts, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast. Just scroll down on that Apple Podcast app on the Friends Talking Fantasy page until you start seeing stars. Once you're seeing stars, the number that would be most helpful for supporting the show would be to click 5 of them. And if you do have some extra time and want to leave a review as well, that also helps our show so much. But just listening to us talk about Glokta in depth like this, listening to any of our episodes, that is more than enough. Thank you so much. We're super grateful.
Thank you all for listening. We are eternally grateful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.